Hello and welcome back. Today I want to go into detail just a little bit on the service plan. We talked about that some in the status hearing, but I want to go into some more details and emphasis on it. Remember that it's supposed to be tailored so that if the parents complete it, then the child should be returned to them. So you want to work with your client and with the department. I'm assuming you're representing a parent in this case. Then you want to work with them to make sure that it is tailored for success. Press the department, make them do that. When you get to final trial, if they're trying to terminate rights, one of the things they're going to argue is that the client didn't complete services. Or if the client did complete services, rights should still be terminated for some reason. Well, it shouldn't be because they didn't have the services they needed. If your client needs services, then the department is supposed to offer them, and the service plan is supposed to be tailored to help the client get their children back. And it orders the department as well as the client to do these things. So make sure it has all the services that are necessary. One of the common things that CPS will argue in final trial is that the parent just checked the box. They didn't actively engage. Well, that happens, and obviously it's a concern. So that's just part of you working with your client to help them, encourage them to engage, to get the help that they need, whatever that is. You can help them by making sure that they get all the services they need and none of the ones that they don't need. This puts a burden on the client, and so they should, it takes a lot of time, some of these, so they should engage in the ones that are necessary for them and not waste time on ones that aren't. You're also going to want to encourage them to focus on the ones that are most important. If domestic violence is the primary issue in the case, well, then the batterer's intervention course is going to be probably the most valuable, that along with therapy. But you want to talk to them about that and get them to engage as quickly as they can and let them know which ones to focus on. As you'll see in my video on termination grounds, completing 99% of your service plan is not enough. Technically, that is true. If your client didn't finish 100% of their service plan, and at least it's partially their fault, it doesn't have to be entirely, but it does have to be partially their fault, then that's technically a ground for termination. However, if you're at 99%, even though they've met the technical ground, they're probably not going to be able to show best interest in most cases. That's why this is important, and that's why it's important that you have the client focus on the most valuable ones especially. Try to complete everything, but if they get to the end and it's a domestic violence case and they've done a parenting class and have done a drug and alcohol assessment, shows that there's no drug and alcohol issues and this other stuff, but they haven't addressed the domestic violence, that's not going to do them a lot of good. So work with them to focus on that and work with CPS to make sure that it's just the ones that they actually need. The department is supposed to develop the service plan with the parents. That doesn't happen all the time. Matter of fact, a lot of times it doesn't happen. Now, to be fair, a lot of times it's the parents' fault. They're angry, they're busy, whatever reason it is, they're not getting in touch with the caseworker. And you can help facilitate that, and you can be involved as their attorney and set up a meeting with them and with the caseworker to go over what services. Make sure that the services are all that they are actually set up, not just in the plan. CPS is a bureaucracy. The worker will fill out the form, send it off to administrative assistant, who probably sends it to another one, then it gets sent off. I'm not sure what the whole process is, but they have gotten lost in the process. And the parent shows up at the service provider and they say, we haven't gotten anything. So you want to make sure that's done, make sure it's done quickly so that it's not another delay for the parents. Unfortunately, when you get to the final, there's going to have been delays. assuming you're going for termination and this is one of the grounds they're pushing, one of the problems is that nothing got done early on and then you ran out of time. Well, you need to make sure that that is not your client's fault, or as minimally your client's fault as possible. So stay on top of that and help them to stay on top of it. So some common services they'll ask for, and these are not necessarily needed in every case, but they're asked for in pretty much every case in many counties. A drug and alcohol assessment. They may ask for that even if there's been no drug or alcohol issues. You know, on the surface, it's like, okay, I understand that. Let's see if there's any issues we don't know about. But on the other hand, especially if your client is working, if your client is doing other things, it's just another thing that takes up time and can interfere in completing other services. A psychological assessment, you know, that one's going to be hard to get around. You're probably going to need that unless they've had one recently in which they can, if they have on their own or for some other reason, they can sign a release and then the department can get that. But most of the issues that come up in a CPS case, drugs, domestic violence, things like that, they have a psychological component. Quite often those things coincide with mental health, and so getting an assessment is probably something that the court is going to insist on. Counseling, we could probably all use counseling, but again, make sure that it is something that is tailored to your client, and explain it to them and talk to them about how they can get the most out of it. Also make sure they understand that nothing in there is confidential. Drug testing, if there's any kind of drug concern or drug history, drug testing is going to be on most of the service plans or on all the service plans in those situations. But what kind of testing, how often, things like that. You know, stay on top of that, because again, that can interfere with your client's job and everything. And again, CPS workers are human beings, and there's all kinds of CPS workers, just like there's all kinds of human beings. And some of them may be very reasonable in how often they want your client to test, and some of them may not be. So if that becomes an issue, step in, talk to the worker, talk to the supervisor, and then if necessary, go to the court. Employment and housing are always a big one. You know, if your client's not working, encourage them to find employment. You know, if there may be a reason why they can't work, and then of course you've got to address that. But the department has resources to help them find employment. So make the department provide those resources and have your client use them and work towards that. And housing, obviously, if they're going to want their children back with them, they need a home for the child. It doesn't require anything fancy. You don't have to have a 3-bedroom home to have a child or anything like that. It's safe and stable home. That's kind of the catchphrase CPS looks at, and that's what we're talking about. It's really about safety. Stable as far as that applies to safety really these days. So that's all you have to have. And a motel may work. It may not, but it doesn't necessarily not work. A big one that certainly works is living with grandma. Lots of people do that. They have for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. There's nothing wrong with that. The point is they're providing a safe home. How they do it is nobody's business as long as it's not anything illegal. Parenting class, if you've got a child in CPS care, they're probably going to require a parenting class. So those are common ones that you'll see. But if you think of something, ask for it. Talk to your client first, but then ask for it. Some courts will order the department to provide special services if you can show that it's relevant to your client. Talking about housing, there are services to help a client find housing. Again, I've never had to go through getting housing assistance, but I can imagine that it's a bureaucratic process. And so you've got people here who deal with it all the time, the CPS workers and their support staff. They're familiar with the system. They can help. Now, they can only help so much. I know a lot of times the housing assistant, there's a long waiting line and it may not do you any good. It's something to look into and see what other housing options there are. Well, that's it. I just wanted to go over those quick points and keep these things in mind when you're developing the service plan with CPS and in explaining the service plan to your client if you're representing the parents. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.